I'm Roy Hamilton. I work for the Cherokee Nation, the Office of the Secretary of State, and I'm detailed to history and preservation and other projects. Among my projects is one that I'm working on now called the One Big Family Project, which is collecting Cherokee genealogy data to build a Cherokee genealogy database for our people and for others who are researching Cherokees. So I have about 70,000 Cherokee in my database. Not all Cherokee, some are spouses and such, or parents of spouses. So that would mean that not everybody in the database is Cherokee, but are in some way connected to specific Cherokees. So from that, we hope to build a larger database, and we use it at our Cherokee Genealogy Research Center, which is called the Cherokee Family Research Center there at Park Hill, just outside of Tahlequah, our capital city. And I'm from a little neighboring town called Stillwell, or that's my address, and I live in a rural community called Wahela. It was originally called Awahila, which means where the eagles rest, in honor of a family by the last name of Eagle, which were my ancestors. Most of my ancestors were by the name of Christie. When they took an English name, they took the Christie name and came from around present-day Murphy, North Carolina. So for about 20 to 25 years, I've had this great interest in Cherokee genealogy, brought about by my mother and her work she did for our ceremonial people. She kept records at our ceremonial ground of different families and people who attended. She would keep birth dates, things like that. So after she had passed, I was looking through her things. I found that, and from that, I began to build this particular database that I'm working on today. Cherokee genealogy isn't a great deal different than any other type of genealogy. You should always start with yourself and work backwards, as we say. But there are some specific things about Cherokees that are unique to doing their genealogy. And among those are your reason for doing that genealogy. So being Cherokee, we always think, well, you're Cherokee because you have a genetic DNA that makes you that way. Well, while that may be true, there are many other factors that must be considered when you're talking about who we are as a people. For example, I'm talking about Cherokee Nation, where I'm a citizen in particular. There's 3 federally recognized tribes, and all of them have different criteria for being a citizen of their particular nation. The Cherokee Nation, our criteria is based on something called the Dawes Row, and I'll talk about that in a moment. You can be doing your Cherokee genealogy research for a couple of reasons. One might be you want to become a citizen, and the other might be, well, I just have Cherokee ancestry, and I want to prove that bloodline. I want something to document that. You know, we often hear people say my ancestor was a full-blood Cherokee. There's seldom any other quantum, apparently. There's a statement that's made by many people trying to investigate their family heritage, and in reality, Cherokee people had no concept of a blood quantum or degree until that was introduced at the time of the Dawes Row, about 1900. And we'll try to clarify some of the misconceptions that come along with being Cherokee as we talk about genealogy research. Prior to and even after European contact, the Cherokee people were a social, cultural society based on something called the clan system. So our kinship wasn't based around what we would today call aunts, uncles, cousins, grandma, grandpa. While we had all of those things, our idea of family was based more around, you're of the same clan I am, you're my brother, you're my sister. And of course, if they're an older person, they're my aunt, they're my uncle. If they're even older, they're my grandpa or they're my grandma. Clanship comes through the female because we're a matrilineal society. So if your mother was Cherokee, you were Cherokee. That kind of solved it at one time. In particular, one of the best examples is John Ross, who was our principal chief for almost 40 years, was always thought of nothing except Cherokee when his biological makeup was, he was 1/8 Cherokee and the rest of other nationalities. But that was never a concept for the Cherokee. He was just Cherokee because his mama was Cherokee, right? And today, the clan system still exists, of course, but not as many people have one because at some point a female was introduced into the family who was not Cherokee or didn't have a clan, so her children would not have a clan. The only exception to that might be an adoption into a clan at some point in their life, but that's kind of a rarity, although it still happens today. Adoption isn't something that happens easily or very often. I'm very lucky. I have a continual, or I consider myself lucky, a continual female line through my mother, my grandmother, so on and so forth. So I have a clan today, and I'm of the Bird clan. So anybody else of Bird clan is my brother or sister, my nephew or my niece, or my aunt or my uncle, or my grandma or my grandpa. But life ways change, and as they change, we're influenced by the world around us. We begin to see a change in our life ways, and the former definition of who we were would change and become who we are today. And that is, we have cousins, aunts, uncles, biological brothers, sisters. So that's more often the concept that you would see. So who are we? Well, we're many things. As you can tell by looking at me, I'm a makeup of several different nationalities, but my unique cultural identity is Cherokee. And by saying that, I mean I don't know anything but the Cherokee. So I would presume that most people have a unique cultural identity in their life, no matter what it might be. So, you wake up one morning and you don't even realize it, but you begin your day doing those things that you were reared to do, or you were brought up in the atmosphere to do. Me, I was brought up with a Cherokee mother who every day did Cherokee things. So that's all I understand. So other people's cultural identity I don't identify with, and I respect those most definitely. But those are things that the art of kinship is different for each of us. So what defines a family? Well, there's many definitions, of course. Who defines that family? Well, usually it is yourself. You pick who you'll pick your family because it's based either on biology, somebody you sort of, with lack of another word, you will adopt them as your family. It might be your best friend. It might be a partnership or a companionship that you identify. So, but there's the introduction of the cousin for us. And that's when we begin to move away from always using the term clanship as an identity factor. And we began to use the Western idea of who we are, or who we are as a people. Clan, of course, never diminished. It always existed. But then we factor in biology, nationality, and race. And then skipping up about in the late 1800s, the idea of this thing called allotment will become a big topic in the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation by that time is in where it's at today in Oklahoma, at that time Indian Territory. We are a distinct sovereign tribal nation identified as a domestic dependent nation by the Supreme Court. This is our 1889 council. We had a large council, much larger than we have today. And at that time we had a Senate, and this is a picture of our Senate at that time. I bring them up because they are faced with a monumental task of dealing with the idea of allotment. And there's the passing of the Curtis Act, then there's the passing, of course, of the Dawes Act itself. Citizenship courts will begin to open, and what we're doing is we're begging or pleading with our citizens to come home back to the Cherokee Nation. If you have been gone for more than 6 months and haven't returned, you are no longer a citizen of our nation, and we consider you a citizen of that particular place you have moved to. So, for example, if you were in Arkansas, Missouri, Texas, any of those surrounding states of what is present-day Oklahoma, you were considered a citizen of the United States by us by that time, and a citizen of that particular state. So to become a citizen of the nation again, you had to make a request before the Citizenship Court. But what that did was open up a flood of non-Cherokee opportunities. So people began to move into the nation itself, saying they were Cherokee based on perhaps a particular surname, or because they knew there was a land allotment involved in the process. The General Allotment Act would have been in 1887. So 5 tribes were to accept the allotment in 1893. but they refused. The 5 tribes are sometimes, in the past, been referred to as the 5 civilized tribes. I myself and others prefer just 5 tribes today, because we think all tribes were civilized in their particular manner, and the use of that term may distinguish us as something better than someone else, and we don't consider ourselves such. The Curtis Act in 1895 dissolved tribal governments, and it forced allotment during 1901. The Cherokee Nation kept less than 1/3 of 1% of any land we had. By that I mean they allowed cemeteries to continue to exist. Almost everything else, schools were taken by the state of Oklahoma. The infrastructure itself, buildings, things like that were given to the state. As compensation, the Cherokee would become citizens in 1901, and they're allowed to vote. The Cherokee Nation was officially dissolved on March the 3rd, 1906, but in truth, they weren't totally dissolved, because within all that paperwork, there was the terminology included that said they would continue in full force and effect. Because of that, we exist today. They left that in there because they needed us to continue to be able to continue to take from us. So when oil was discovered, they had to have a way to legally take it on paper. So they established what we call chiefs for a day. So they would say, you're the chief today, you come in, and here's a pile of papers we need you to sign. And they would sign all of those papers, and then he was no longer chief. Then when they needed somebody else again, they would appoint a chief, and that would continue for several years. The present government would be established or formed in 1948 after a passage of the Wheeler-Howard Indian Reorganization Act, but then not officially till about 1974, when we established a new constitution, and it's the forefather of our government today. This is the original Dawes Commission in the bigger picture, and that's Henry Dawes himself in the small picture there. So it begins about 1887. It goes on through, particularly about 1902, you'll see a lot of applications on the Dawes Final Row. It seems to be the most popular time period, but there's a lot from 1900 to 1902. There are exceptions, but very few, and those exceptions will continue to 1913. By exceptions, I mean they missed some orphan children, and they missed some people in the military, or people who had been away at school, so they made exceptions and allowed them to be enrolled later. Sometimes you'll hear the term too late, but that's not really an official term. It's sort of a term that was born to explain how these people ended up on a road that was supposed to end in 1902. For me to be a citizen today, I have to prove a direct lineal ancestry to somebody on the final Dawes Row, and through that I get a certificate of degree of Indian blood. Now, if I'm just trying to prove I'm Cherokee for, because I know I'm not eligible for citizenship, but I have an ancestor, then we always say you do it the same way. You look for them on census documents every 10 years. You get as much family information as you can, and you do it as if you were doing any other type of genealogy. I always say if you're searching the Dawes Row, there are several sites on the internet, but I always recommend accessgeneaology.com. Oklahoma History Center has a searchable tablet there. But Ancestry has a lot more documents. They have the other rolls, and there's numerous rolls. And although there's an 1817, 1819, the reservee rolls, I always talk about the first really major census of the Cherokee was the Henderson roll in 1835, or sometimes it's just called the 1835 census. It was done by the United States as an assignment to the Army to calculate where Cherokee were to prepare for the removal. They thought if there was a resistance from us, they needed to know where we were, particularly our men of a warring age. So they did this census, and I think there's about 12,000 Cherokee on there. So that means they missed about 4,000 to 5,000 that aren't on there. I have family on there, but my direct lineal ancestry are not on the 1835 census. Their family members are, but they miss them. It's one of the missed families. Then they don't do another one until Indian Territory in 1851, and they will do the Drennan Row. And from the Drennan Row, it's not really helpful, although I always say look at it. It's more helpful after you skip forward and you can establish who your family was in 1900 and where they were, and then go back and look at the Drennan Row, and it will make more sense to you. And the reason I say that is a lot of it is in Cherokee names. It'll have head of household at the top, and then just a list of who's in that household. You won't know if it's a child, a spouse, a mother, a father, a grandparent, until maybe later on you will establish that through other research, come back and you go, oh yeah, that's who they are, and there they are. So you can use it as a documentation form. I think it's most useful as that at a later date. Then, like I said, they do the 1880 census, they do an 1896 census, and if you're on the 1880 or the 1896, the Dawes Commission will automatically accept you as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. If they can't find you on there, there will be a lot of questions, and unless you can satisfy them that you were there or you've been readmitted through a Citizenship Court, the Dawes Commission wouldn't accept you as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. If they didn't accept you as a citizen of the nation, you wouldn't get a Dawes Row number, and you wouldn't get an allotment. You would be rejected. The rejecteds are available, of course, at the National Archive, and the most common reason for rejection, in my opinion, is residency. You had to live in the Cherokee Nation and be a citizen before you could be considered for Dawes. So like I said, if your ancestor was Cherokee but they're living somewhere else, they hadn't came back and filed for to be readmitted as a citizen, the Dawes Commission would reject them. And usually in those documents, those case files in the National Archives, you can read those and you will discover the reason they were rejected. So they had to live in Indian Territory or Oklahoma, and they had to have been a citizen, like I said. I mentioned there's federally recognized 3 tribes in Oklahoma, the United Kituah Band, which is also based off of the Dawes Row, and the other tribe is in North Carolina, of course, the Eastern Band Cherokee Indians, and they are based off of an 1829 Baker Row, which is a base row that they would use. They have other criteria for citizenship, and I recommend you look at their website to read all about that. The UKB have other requirements for citizenship, and that too would be at their website if you wanted to look at what their criteria was. For the Cherokee Nation, the only criteria are that you have a direct lineal ancestor on the Dawes Final Row, and you are able to prove that by birth or death certificates to get you to about 1900. For me, it's my grandmother, so in my opinion, it's not real difficult to get to that time period. I have a birth certificate that my mother received later in her life. My birth certificate was issued later in my life because I was born at home, so I have a delayed birth certificate. My mother had a very delayed birth certificate. She didn't get hers till she was about 65 or so, but she managed to get it. Her mother didn't have a birth certificate, but she had a death certificate. But that would be my grandmother, who was on the Dawes Final Row, and all I needed was my mother's birth certificate because that lists her as her mother. So from that, I would be eligible for citizenship in the Cherokee Nation today. And that's how you get back to the Dawes Final Row. Those rows before that, or anything that might come later, do not play a role in citizenship. So if I found them on the 1880 census or the 1896 census in the Cherokee Nation, but they're not on the Dawes Final Row, that doesn't count. They have to be on the Dawes Final Row. There's another row that's done a few years later in 1909, and for genealogical research, I think it's the best row that was ever done, and it's called the Guillen-Miller Row. And I say that because they ask a lot more questions, whereas before they weren't really interested in your genealogy. They were more interested in establishing you as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation during the Dawes Row. So the Guillen-Miller Row is more interested in, well, who are you? How did you get here? It's sometimes called the Eastern Cherokee Applications. And they're calling it that because we came from the East. So they're basing it off of who our family was that came. So the old settlers won't be on, usually. There's always an exception to every rule. By nature and by form, they shouldn't be on the Miller Row. So if they were Old Settler, you can look for them on the Old Settler Row, but Old Settler people are harder to research, although you will find many of them on the Dawes Row as well, of course. But that Miller Row will ask who are your parents, who are your children, and who your grandparents are. And sometimes your your grandparents, siblings, things like that. So you get much more data out of it. It'll ask what year they died. It'll ask you what your birthday is and where you were born. If you're married, what your spouse's name is. So I find them very beneficial, and especially if you find them in 1909, and then you're going backwards, and you find them on the Dawes Row, and then you go into 1851, and by then it makes more sense to you looking at the 1851 Drennan Row, and then you skip to 1835. If you find them in the 1835, it's by state, and it'll tell you where they lived. It won't list everybody in the household, but it breaks it down into age groups, and it will tell you whether they had slaves, what kind of farm, and by that I mean how many, what kind of orchard they had, a corn crib. It talks about things like that. And remember, they're not doing the 1835 again for genealogy. They're doing it to establish where you were at, what your location is. So it'll say on Notley Creek, it'll say along the Hiawassee River, it'll tell where they were living as a family unit. The idea, the purpose of the Dawes Row, of course, was to establish an allotment. An allotment was a piece of land that would be given to this individual, and they would end Cherokee Nation's ownership of land in common, and it would become individually owned. The Dawes Commission, early on, somebody had made the statement, the Cherokee would never, and I'm paraphrasing, the Cherokee would never prosper any farther. They had gone as far as they were going to go. And the reason they weren't going to go any farther is because they didn't know what greed was. So they thought to introduce the system of greed, you have to introduce the system of ownership. So they said, we'll give them ownership, and then from that, they'll build on it. You know, they'll want more land. They'll want to build a bigger farm. They'll want more things. We were very happy with the way things were before that. We used what we wanted, and what we didn't, we allowed somebody else to use. So it wasn't as important to us as a ownership thing. It was more important to us as something that the Creator had given us and we could utilize and share. And we didn't think people had the right to own that, a piece of land. But the land allotment came about, and so your Dawes Row number is in correlation to your allotment number. So they'll make out these plat maps of the Cherokee Nation. In the plat maps, they will write your row number, and they'll tell you where your land is. They tried to, I think, make it where you were living, but there wasn't enough land to give to everybody where they lived, so they usually broke it up. So you get your certificate of allotment, and then you might get a homestead allotment. So the homestead allotment would be where they expected you to live, and then to make up, because they had to give you a certain amount. My grandma got 120 acres, and she received hers all together, but she was very lucky in that regard. Some would get their homestead, say 20 acres, and then the rest of their land might be way up in the other part of Oklahoma. So what would happen? Well, they would homestead, and they just forgot about that other piece. It wasn't important to them, remember? We're not so concerned with the ownership. So that's one way, that's how we lost a lot of our land, is we didn't go take ownership of it. So at some point, somebody took it from us, usually illegally. In my particular case, my great-grandparents also received allotments, one on one side of a section line, my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother on the other. About 1915, the county commissioner came and told and this is documented in records at the county courthouse, told him that he hadn't paid his taxes, he would have to leave. He didn't question it at all. He didn't know what he meant by taxes in the first place. And truthfully, he didn't know taxes. The land was in restriction, meaning he didn't have to pay taxes on it. But he didn't know that, so he abandoned it. And then he went to live on his wife's allotment with her. So what happens to that land? The county commissioner put it in his name, and then he later sells it and so on and so forth. So he just took it from him by lying to him, And that's not uncommon. So to read more about things like that, I always recommend a book called And Still the Waters Run by Angie DeBow. And she talks a lot about the fraudulent activity and all of the things that were happening during the allotment process. And Ms. DeBow did a great job and is very well respected in that regard of documenting her research. And she wasn't recognized at the time of her work, but many years later in her 80s and in her late age, people began to realize she had told the truth, and people began to publish her work that wasn't published before. So, And Still the Waters Run is one of the better books that I always recommend to everybody. So the Cherokee Nation today has no particular blood quantum. And I say that because, like I said, you just have to have a direct lineal ancestor. So I apply for my citizenship. I am accepted. I received what we used to call a blue card because it was blue. But today it's more like a photo ID, like a driver's license. And it still has a blue hue to it, so many of us still call it the blue card. But that's our citizenship card. And it's, like I said, it's somewhat like a driver's license. And it's a federal ID that I only use. That's the only identification I use. I have an Oklahoma driver's license, but I pretend I don't. And I always use the Cherokee Nation citizenship card because it's so important to me that people accept that form of identification. And so far, it hasn't been a problem. On the back side of that is what we call our CDIB card nowadays, and that will have a blood quantum, and it's based off of the original Dawes enrollee, and then if they marry another Cherokee, they take a combination thereof. If they marry a non-Cherokee, of course, it would be cut in half. So if you were half Cherokee, you married a non-Cherokee, your children will be 1/4 on their CDIB card, or their certificate of degree of Indian blood. And like I said, they do require that you document back with some type of original certified copies. And you can go to Cherokee.org and look at registration, and the documents are there for applications, and it explains somewhat about how that process should happen. The qualification for Dawes enrollment was an individual was established as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, done through the 1880 and 1896, like I said. So you need to keep these things in mind. The one thing that most people always forget or don't take into account is residency. If you weren't a citizen, meaning live there, you won't be on the Dawes final row, unless the exception being you'd come back and were readmitted, but still you would be living there by then. So it's a residency requirement. The U.S. Census for the year 2000 said there was about 750,000 people who identified themselves as Cherokee. About 265 of those individuals are actual documented citizens of the Cherokee Nation at that time. Today, we are a citizenship of about 320,000. We're the largest tribal nation in the United States. We are a sovereign nation. There with a capital of Tahlequah in Oklahoma, which is in the northeastern part of the state. And I hope you'll ever in that area, you'll come visit us. This document, to me, is the most important document the Cherokee Nation ever had, although it isn't recognized today. And this is our land patent. This is the deed to our land, given to us by the United States, saying they would never again take it from us. And the original document is in our National Archives, and a copy on display at our National Museum there outside of Tahlequah at Park Hill. And it is saying, the actual, the longitude, latitude, the section lines, this, that, and that. It's like a deed to your house, but it's a deed to our nation. It's the highest form of land ownership, although not recognized today. We did try to save the idea of an Indian state, and that would have been called the state of Sequoia. And I add this in just because I think it's important that people know that genealogy isn't just based on names and dates. What was happening around those people often plays a role in understanding about one's family. So we joined with the other 5 tribes, and we tried to form the state of Sequoia. The United States denied us that opportunity. They then took everything we had established, our counties, our way we had laid out, everything, our seal, they took everything and put it into the formation of the state of Oklahoma. This is a historical caricature from that time period, and this is supposed to be the Cherokee Nation, and it kind of speaks for itself. But we often see it used as an explanation of what was happening to our government at the time of allotment. And as I said, we're the largest tribe in the United States. About 70,000 of our citizens reside in a 7,000 square mile area of the Cherokee Nation. It's not a reservation, and we often hear that term, are you from the reservation in Oklahoma? And we say, no, there are no reservations in Oklahoma, and never have been. We are an actual jurisdictional area. So the correct terminology for us is the TJSA, or a Tribal Jurisdictional Service Area. And that includes 8 counties and a portion of 6 there in northeast Oklahoma. We're a leader in health services, education, housing, vocational training, business, and economic development. And we recently gave, in the past year, we gave over $4 million to education in our state. So we're, along with other tribes, are a significant presence economically and to the cultural identity of our state as it is. So I'm very proud of our nation and the other tribal nations that contribute so much to the state of Oklahoma. And it reaches beyond there. We have many citizens, obviously, outside of the 70,000, who live all over the United States and around the world. So our job is to try to, of course, keep contact with those individuals as well. So as a result, we go out to what we call our at-large satellite communities. And one of those is Washington, D.C., where we have the capital city Cherokee community. And I'm very proud of the fact that they've organized, they meet, and they try to carry on that unique cultural identity that is who we are. Do you have any questions? That's pretty much genealogy for the Cherokee. It's somewhat different, but also very similar in format. Well, if you find you have questions, you can reach me at roy-hamilton@cherokee.org, or you can call me at my office phone, which is 918-453-5210. So feel free to email me or call me when I'm back in Tahlequah, and I'll answer any questions you might have. Thank you for listening, and thanks for coming today.